a little after 10. I think we're, thanks, John. Okay, well, I think we're ready to go. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. Thanks for tuning back in. Very excited to have Kassia St. Clair with us. 2 great books, Secret Lives of Color, The Golden Thread. This is hard. This is the same. No, I have the American version because it's COLOR. I don't have the fancy U in it. And then this is also the American version of these books. So, so just like always, we'll just continue. For those of you who have not tuned in before, this is as casual as these get. It's the world of COVID, is to be as casual as possible. So if you have questions for Kassia, just throw them in the chat window. Right now, there's only about 15 of us. Might grow later, but with only 15, 20 of us, you can probably just unmute yourself and ask your question directly. But if you'd like to drop it in the chat window, I can build up a queue. And that's pretty much the rules. That's it. So I thought, Kassia, I don't really have an agenda here, but I thought, so there were maybe 2 questions I'd start with. Maybe if you just want to tell people about yourself and why you wrote these books. And then because this is the Data at Urban Digital Discussion Series, there is one part, well, there's many parts actually of both books that I think actually do apply to data, but the one that I have latched onto is the story in the Colors book about the change in the pink, blue, male, female, gender. Yeah, arena. Yes. So I'll just leave it there, and then we'll just take it from there. Yeah.
Okay. So to introduce myself, hello everyone. My name is Kassia, and I'm a British writer based in London. I've written 2 books. The first one is about colour. The second one is about textiles. And I'm working on my 3rd one at the moment. So actually, I usually work by myself in the little shed at the bottom of my garden, and I'm still doing that during COVID. And it's made me work a lot harder because that's all I've got to do. But I became really interested in colour in parts just as a child. My mother was a florist, and I went to a day school in London. And my school day would finish, and I'd walk up the road and I'd sit in her flower shop while she sort of shut up shop and prepared for the next day. And I just remember I would be sitting in her shop a little bit bored, and I'd be given the sort of the flowers that were a bit bashed about, or had been where, you know, the stems weren't, you know, long enough for whatever reason, that weren't going to be making it into the official bouquets. And I'd be given these little flowers to make up into little bouquets of my own. So I started playing around with colour at a very young age. And then academically, I became interested at university. I was studying history, and more specifically the history of 18th century women's fashion, which was great fun to research. It basically meant that I would be reading diaries and letters and newspaper accounts of, you know, from the 18th century, usually about fabulous parties that had been thrown in London at this time. And I found it really fascinating that from these letters and diaries and accounts, there was this whole other language of colours that no longer existed, and that actually it was really difficult to track down what they might look like. You'd have to find visual sources, and they sometimes weren't easy to find. And I just became fascinated that, you know, colours had lived for a brief moment and then had passed away and had this kind of elusive quality to them. This led me to write a column about colour for a British magazine called Elle Decoration. I know there's an American equivalent as well. And then this led to the writing of my first book, The Secret Lives of Colour, with a U in the UK, without a U in the US.
Right. I don't know if you want to talk about, do you want to talk about colour first? Before we go to the thread?
Whichever.
I mean, so, okay. Well, so I'll also link to we did a podcast together that we did. So, so for those of you who haven't maybe read the book, this is how it's organized by, like the outer part of the book is pretty amazing. It's just like, you have the color on the page, which is great. So maybe we can talk about the red, the pink blue dichotomy, because again, I find it fascinating. and then we can talk about thread.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So this is one of the stories that I think gets a lot of attention, and I get sort of asked about a lot because it's just really fascinating to people. It's still kind of fascinating to me. One of the arguments of the book, if there is an argument, is that colours and their meanings change quite a lot over time, and so it's very hard to pin colours down because they are dependent on cultural factors and our kind of cultural beliefs about a color. That's what gives them their importance and their spirit. And the most, the best example of this, I think, is the sort of gendered quality that pink and blue have. I think I'm a child of the 1980s, and I know that I spent my entire childhood being stuffed into baby pink dresses, and pink was very much the color of girlhood, and blue and blue, and to a lesser extent green, were the colors that boys got to wear. And this is sort of something that I've really grown up with. And it was very surprising to me when I started doing my research, and I look back just 100 years, not that long ago, and saw evidence that had been completely the other way around, that in fact pink had been the color that was most associated with boys and masculinity, and blue had been the color associated predominantly with femininity. And I found this incredible, and I also found the fact that it had shifted quite so quickly really surprising, and that people who were talking about this 100 years ago were so convinced of the rightness of their position. They were so convinced that blue was dainty and feminine, and that red was kind of decided, or pink was decided and masculine and associated with very hyper masculine qualities. And to read those things now is so surprising because it has completely flipped around.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's something you and I have discussed briefly, and folks in the data viz community talk about all the time, is this pink blue. It's familiar, but it's also terribly condescending and well, okay. So we'll leave it at that. Let's talk about the thread. So, which I'm calling the thread, but the golden thread. It's about the history of fabric. I'm curious on two levels about this book, about two things about this book. First is how you did the research for this, because it is intense. Like, I could feel like behind the scenes it must have been intense. And two, there's a difference. The tone is a little bit different between the two books, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. The Secret Lives of Color feels more I don't know, like there's a little individual story for each color. Mm-hmm. The Golden Thread, each part of it it's more of kind of a bigger story. It's not necessarily about individuals. So I think those questions sort of wrap together a little bit. It's a bit about your approach to writing these two books and how you think about weaving that narrative together.
Mm-hmm. So with the color book, there'd been this very long build-up. I'd been writing the column for many years, and I'd really had in my mind a book. I could really picture it in my mind's eye well before I got a literary agent, well before any editor had agreed to take the book. And so by the time that I actually got down to writing it, it was like taking the lid of a pressure cooker. It was just really intense, very, very fast. And the book was there in my mind already written, and it was just a question of kind of getting it down on the page. When you come to doing a second project, or another, your next piece of work, you want to kind of challenge yourself, and you want to it sounds, there's no way of saying it so that it doesn't sound really pretentious, but you kind of want to move your practice on. You want to develop your skills as a writer. You don't just want to stay in the same place. And so initially there was a thought that I could write the secret lives of textiles, the secret lives of thread. and it would be exactly the same. It would just be covering different types of textile as opposed to different types of color. And I was wary of that. I wanted to do something that stretched me a little bit more. And the other thing that kind of gave the golden thread, I think, its particular feel and why it feels different, is because with the color book, I never had any reason to doubt, or I had far fewer reasons to doubt that what I was doing was worth people's time. You know, I was really excited about it. I think a lot of people are very passionate about color, you know, designers, artists, you know, it feeds into so many areas of people's lives. But I had a very different reaction with textiles. So the contract was signed before The Secret Lives of Colour even came out in the UK. So it was already sort of set in stone that I was going to do this book about textiles. And people would, you know, friends or people who were reading The Secret Lives of Colour would ask me, what are you working on now? And when I would reply and say, I'm working on a book about textiles, people's faces would just shut down. They would, you know, their eyes would glaze over, and it would just be like, this is not a book I'm interested in, or I will not be reading this, which is horrifying as a writer, because you're like, oh God, no one's going to read it. How mortifying. And so I think, you know, I really felt a bit defiant. I was like, you know, textiles are vitally important. They reach back throughout our, you know, right back into the very sort of earliest traces of humankind. You can find sort of evidence of textiles, and they're super useful. Oh, good. I'm glad someone else was excited about textiles, and it wasn't just me preaching to my friends who were like, oh, I'm gonna have to pity by it. So yeah, so I was really excited and really kind of defiant, and I really wanted to prove people wrong and to prove that textiles were worthy of our attention and worthy of being taken seriously. So I tried to find stories that would help me tell that story very compellingly, and that might surprise people and sort of wrong foot them. So I think people, when you say textiles, people immediately think fashion. And while fashion is very important, I also want to say, well, no, this is also about exploration, sailcloth, you know, the very earliest traces of humankind that we know about through archaeology. This stretches into a lot of worlds that you might not expect, into space. In fact, one of my favorite chapters is about the Apollo 11 mission. So I really tried to sort of find surprising stories, and I tried to make it persuasive.
Yeah, I mean, it is part, well, not even part. I mean, it is a history book, right? And it's this. Yeah, I could see why people would think it might be about fashion, but it's really not about fashion. I mean, there's a whole, for those who haven't read it, there's a whole chapter about, you know, Vikings, you know, Viking conquest and Viking travel to North America before Christopher Columbus, right? Like, there's this whole historical part to it, which is this, you know, why I really dug into it. I'll just see if there are any questions to start. If you do have a question, you can just unmute yourself. There may be like a wave your hand thing. I don't really know, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. And if not, do you want to, Kassia, do you want to talk about, like, is there a particular chapter or topic in the other of the books that you want to talk about?
So there are a couple that I think people find very surprising. So I think the Apollo 11 one is possibly one of the most fun to talk about, and then the other one that I absolutely love is the very final chapter, in which I talk about textiles of the future, and in particular spider silk. So to start with the Apollo 11, you know, when you think of people landing on the moon for the first time, you don't appreciate that textiles were a fundamental part of that effort, and you simply cannot expect humans to sort of move around and walk around comfortably in space, although comfortable is a very relative term when you're talking about space travel, if you aren't reliant in some form on textiles. And the other thing that I found fascinating was that the suits that ended up being used for the Apollo 11 mission were very much the product of evolution, an evolution that started with ballooning in the 18th century and had become more sophisticated, but still not that sophisticated. The human body is just not designed to function well in space. You've got the extremes of temperature on the lunar surface. You've got exposure to G-forces. There's no gravity. There's all these things that a suit has to counter. And it's got to counter all those things whilst you still being able to wear it and move around in it and perform functions in it. Things like pressing buttons and getting up and down stairs and stuff like that. And I just found the fight to create these suits a brilliant story, not least because the company that NASA eventually ended up using to create these suits was a company I think no one, perhaps especially NASA, expected to come to rely on. And that is a company called Playtex, who are most famous for creating women's underwear. And although NASA wanted to, they were quite embarrassed by this association in a way, and they sort of wanted to downplay the role of Playtex and their expertise. But it was really Playtex's expertise with bras, with girdles, that allowed them to create the suits, literally. So in some of the early tests, the astronauts were complaining about chafing in the suits. As you might expect, these things are not very comfortable, and so you're moving around in them and you're getting chafing. Well, Playtex knew what to do. They'd handled this problem before when it came to women's girdles, and so they had this sort of fluffy girdle liner that they were using for women's undergarments, and they just sewed that in to the Apollo 11 spacesuits. And equally, sort of one of the very fundamental layers of the Apollo 11 spacesuits is a kind of bladder made out of latex that is kind of completely sealed, so that so that the human body won't be exposed to zero gravity, not to zero gravity, to the vacuum of space. And this latex was embedded with a certain type of nylon mesh to stop it ballooning and becoming too rigid. And that nylon mesh was used by Playtex in women's bras, exactly the same nylon mesh. So I found this just brilliant, and yeah. I loved the sort of the crossover between the two things. Right.
Yeah, that chapter was making me laugh when I saw that part. And then you said the last chapter going forward was one that was memorable for you.
Yes. So there's this funny thing. A lot of the sort of the chapters in the second half of the book sort of, I was reading them back as I was writing them, and I was like, it felt a little bit like not self-congratulatory, but kind of, oh, humans, aren't we amazing? We've created all these solutions to difficult problems. And I sort of wanted my final chapter in a way to kind of puncture that illusion, and also to look ahead at the future and what might be coming, what might be arriving in the future. And one of the things that I found was had been a persistent effort, sort of 200 years long, to try and harness spiders for their silk making ability. The silk that we generally, if you wear silk, the silk that you'll find is made from the silk of silkworms, and essentially they create their cocoons. The cocoons are then plunged into boiling water to kill the caterpillars, and then the cocoons are unraveled and their thread is used. But what people really were excited about with spider silk is that the silk is much finer and much stronger. And so in theory, you could have a better quality product. And people realized this really very early on in the 16 and 1700s. And they were trying to think of a way of farming spiders in the same way that you can farm silkworms. And various experiments were done with sort of big boxes with little different compartments. You put all the spiders in them and you think, okay, they're going to spin webs and they're going to spin cocoons, and then we can just harvest that silk in the same way that we do with silkworms. But what they found, and it's really funny to read this in kind of, 17th and 16th century English, what they found is that the spiders just weren't happy to be farmed at all. And in fact, quite often, you know, the scientist would come back to the box or the room in which he'd stored all his spiders and would find just kind of one really big aggressive looking spider and lots of legs. So it wasn't a goer. But you know, since the year 2000, scientists have been thinking, okay, well, we still want to use spider silk, but maybe there's a way of doing this without the spiders. Maybe we don't need spiders. Maybe we can genetically modify other animals and have them create the spider silk, but have them not, you know, kill all their fellow animals. So one of the first creatures they decided to try this with, very surprisingly, to my mind at least, was goats. So they edited the genetic sequence of goats and implanted a little bit of DNA that essentially would allow the goats to make spider silk protein along with their milk. And then you milk the goats, the milk contains the spider silk protein, you then in theory extract that, and then you can make make spider silk. This didn't turn out to be commercially viable, and so they tried with other organisms. They tried with E. coli, rather terrifyingly, and then they've subsequently tried with yeast. The yeast experiments have been you know, relatively successful, and there's a company based in San Francisco at the moment who say that they're basically on the cusp of being a commercially viable spider silk protein based textile producer, which in theory is very exciting because this is a textile that you know, is biodegradable, which a lot of modern synthetics aren't, but also in theory could be designed from the molecular level up. So you can say, I want a silk that is incredibly strong and stretchy, and you can create that on a molecular level. You can edit your you know, edit the DNA sequence that you put into the yeast. You then brew the yeast in the same way that you brew beer, and out comes the silk protein with the qualities that you desire, which is very exciting.
Yeah, although I will say, if I put on a shirt and someone said it was spider silk, I would freak out. Like that, just not for me. But
even if no spiders had been harmed, if it was actually
just change the name. Then just change the name. I don't want to have that even like in my head.
Goat silk, is that better? I don't know.
Goat silk is better. Goat silk is better. Goat silk is better for sure. That's definitely better. So there are a few questions here. I think Jesse's question is just dovetails right with what you were just talking about. So is there a way to synthesize the spider silk protein instead of having to involve animals, for goats, I guess?
Yeah, so with goats, like I said, it was really fairly quickly, relatively quickly abandoned. Actually, this herd of goats does still exist, but they're not really still. I mean, they're kind of more of a PR stunt now. It just so happens that they create spider silk protein and will go on producing spider silk protein, which is a bit weird if you think about it. But they very soon kind of pivoted to other ways of creating this, because you need to be able to create this protein, which are really you know, these silks are very complex molecules, and it's really difficult to get them to do exactly what we want. You know, so the silk protein in a spider is liquid within the spider's body, and then as it's extruded, there's a mechanical process that sort of takes place sort of as the silk is moving through the spinnerets, and this changes it from liquid to solid. So it's quite unstable in a way, and so to kind of replicate this has proved incredibly challenging, and to replicate it in a way that could be commercially viable has proven even more challenging. There are several firms, you know, there's one in China, one in Germany, and there's this one, at least one in San Francisco that I know of, working on this problem. And you know, there've been rumblings about things appearing on shop shelves any minute now for about 4 years, and still we're not quite there. So this is clearly something that is very difficult. Actually, I visited one of the factories and I saw a thread being extruded, and it's a slow process. I'm sure that there are many ways of speeding it up, but this was, I think I visited in 2017, and it would have taken a while to create anything at the rate in which it was happening. So yeah.
Yeah. So let's go back a little bit. Lucy has a good question. Lucy, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask directly, or
Hi.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Here. I love it so much. You can see it's well bookmarked.
Oh, fantastic. That's what I love to see.
Yeah. So I studied color as well, and it led me into this study of pigment, and that has such a cool tie over to textiles. And I was wondering if you had any stories that provoked.
Oh yes, absolutely. So as you probably know, from reading the book, a lot of the colors that I talk about in The Secret Lives of Color are dyes, and that is in part what gave them their value, because it's one thing to have a pigment that works on a painting surface, but it's another to really be able to dye cloth very successfully, particularly with bright colors. And so a lot of the colors that we think about as being particularly valuable, or particularly colors of the wealthy or the very powerful, have that status because they were particularly rich dyes. The classic example is royal purple, which is a very sort of high status color, and is associated with royalty, hence the name. And this goes all the way back to really ancient times, where one of the foremost dyes of the ancient world was this dye called Tyrian purple, or imperial purple, that was made from mollusks. And this to me is, lots of beautiful colors come from very unlikely sources, and I think this is one of the least likely sources, and also one of the just absolutely revolting. You'd have to catch all these mollusks. It took around 250,000 individual sea snails to make just a single ounce of this dye. So it was hugely expensive, at times more expensive than gold. But
this smell terrible.
And it smells terrible, in part because to fix this rotting shellfish color onto the textile, as if that wasn't revolting enough, you then have to use a fixative, which involves using stale human urine, which is a great source of ammonia. And because this color was very popular and was able to make people a lot of money back then because it was so expensive, there were huge dye works, and some of these have been excavated, and they're almost always located sort of downwind of the local town, so that the townsfolk didn't have to get the smell from the revolting dye works, but then they would happily wear the Tyrian purple toga as a mark of their high status. I don't know whether it still smelt a little bit, but who knows.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, that was one of my more favorite. There was a similar story. Well, the story in the Golden Thread about silkworms and how the Chinese protected the silkworms from being exported was all similarly not the same sort of gross, but the same sort of like holding on, trying to protect something so valuable in such a weird, something that you might, I don't know, I just never had it makes sense when you read about it, but I hadn't really considered how valuable like a single worm would be. Yeah.
Well, you just don't think now about either textiles or colors as being really valuable commodities, but they were, and they could be really fundamental to a region's wealth. And the efforts that people would go to protect these sources of wealth were incredibly extreme. And also you see these huge collapses. We think about new technology as being very positive, or perhaps, you know, now that with the era of kind of machines, and there's fear about machines taking over humans' jobs, we can relate. But this has happened before, you know, that, you know, when there was this huge industry for dyeing red cloth with madder, and this just collapsed overnight when a synthetic alternative was found in the 19th century, and thousands of people no longer had jobs. Fields that had been dedicated to this one cash crop for generations, you know, there was no longer any need for it, and people had kind of forgotten how to grow anything else. So, you know, colors and textiles do have this really, you cannot study them without looking at their economic importance.
Right. So Nina has a question for you. Nina, I don't know if you want to unmute. I don't know if you're there.
Oh, I have worked with, you know, fibers that are made from milk and fibers that are made from seaweed, and I was wondering, you know, about that process. And I guess the other thing, and I didn't ask this, but, you know, dyeing is so water intensive, and in this age of, you know, thinking about sustainability, I'm wondering, when you think about the future of textiles, how can you even do natural dyeing in a sustainable, using natural substances in a sustainable manner?
So with your first question, with sort of different sources of textile fiber, this is something that I think is really exciting, as well as finding new sources of textile that can be less that need fewer intensive resources. So if you think of less farming area perhaps, or whatever it is. I also think it'd be really nice to see a bit more diversity in the use of textiles for different regions, where it sort of makes sense. So if you think about, if you go back 500 years, different regions would grow different types of textiles along with different crops, and then they would sort of make the use of the textiles that could be grown in their own area. Whereas now we're very, very reliant on just a few types of a few different types of textiles. Some of those are just completely petrochemicals, and then some of them are, you know, for example, wool from sheep or cotton. But there are these really exciting other fibers that have been known about for thousands of years. So for example, bamboo fibers have been discovered by archaeologists in Chinese tombs that make beautiful textiles from bamboo. And like you say, seaweed, you can make wonderful textiles from seaweed. People have been making textiles out of produce that usually goes to waste. So for example, the leaves of pineapple plants, you can make a wonderful textile out of those. And also with the pith of oranges that usually would be wasted because they, you know, the peel is just thrown away, and the flesh is used for orange juice. You can also make a textile out of that. But there is a little bit of reason to be a bit cautious, because some of these processes still are, they might, you know, solve one problem, say by using up a waste product from another industry, but in order to get them to be a workable textile, they might need a very strong chemical, or there might be dangers within the process to change them. So it is an area, unfortunately, that is kind of ripe for greenwashing. And we all need to sort of be a little bit on our guard, because you can hear about a new textile and be like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And then you read a little bit more further into it, and some problems emerge. And it's very difficult for the consumer sometimes to discern between the good and the bad textile. So that's on that level. With the dyes, and thinking about ways of dyeing in less water intensive ways, that is also something that lots of people are giving a great deal of thought to. And one of the quite exciting things that I've seen recently is there's a woman working in the UK who's a biologist and a designer, and she has created a dye made from a bacteria. It's the same bacteria that you find naturally occurring in beetroot. And it's also, you know, that particular smell when it's rained, you get that particular petrichor smell. It's this bacteria that are responsible for that smell. And treated in a certain way, they can create a dye that dyes textiles without the need for any extra water, which is really exciting. And she's a woman called Natsai Chiesa, and she is looking into ways of making this dye more stable. One of the problems with it currently is that it can't create an even finish. And this is something that people usually want. If you buy a red t-shirt, you want the whole t-shirt to be red, and you want it to be a particular, you know, color of red. And at the moment, with this new process, she simply hasn't been able to get that far. Whether in a few years' time that will be possible, I don't know, but I hope so, because it would be really great to find processes that are less destructive than some of the processes that we commonly use now.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question, Nina.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. That's really
Pleasure.
wonderful.
There's another question from Jesse. I don't know if Jesse, you want to ask directly.
Sure. I just
Yeah.
I've seen videos and read a little bit about this Sardinian practice of harvesting mollusk silk, but that it's also a dyeing practice. I find it kind of fascinating, the sort of cultural heritage and also weird, cool fiber. Is there anything being done to keep it alive?
So actually, it's very funny you should ask that, Jesse, because the story of this incredible fiber made from mollusks, actually, I write about a little bit in the very last section of my book, because I also read this story and read some of this research and thought it was just beautiful. So for those of you who don't know, there's a particular type of mollusk that is principally found in the Mediterranean, although there are other sources, I believe, around Central America, and it can create this wonderful fiber that sort of doesn't really look like anything much in the shade. It's kind of like a dull brown, but when the sunlight hits it, it sparkles like gold, and it has been very highly prized for this reason. However, the mollusks that produce this particular type of secretion that can be turned into thread are very sensitive, and so if you disturb their beds too regularly and you harvest this fiber too aggressively, the whole, you know, all bets are off. That the mollusks just can't cope, and the whole lot just die. And so you do get these kind of very because of the beauty of this fiber and because of the sort of fragility of it, you get these amazing systems that are built up around kind of both protecting the knowledge but also protecting the mollusk. And there's a wonderful story about a particular woman who is still working with this mollusk fiber. She refuses to sell any of it. In order to get some, if you want some, you have to go and speak to her, and maybe if she likes you, she'll give you a little woven piece of this wonderful fiber that she's been working with. But she doesn't want to pass the knowledge on because she's too afraid that if she reveals the location of the mollusk beds that she uses, that they'll just get wrecked. And so she is kind of expecting that the knowledge will die with her, which is both rather beautiful and rather sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great story. Does anyone else have any questions for Kassia on anything really? I have a couple more in my head, but give folks the option. I'm wondering about your process, your research process with both of these books. Do you have to do a lot of travel and going into, you know, the Golden Thread book seemed like, I mean, at least the way you've written it, which is maybe just a testament to your writing, like you really feel like you are on the cliffs of There's the story of the old church in Norway, I think, where they're repairing the roof, and they find the sailcloth stuffed into the beams of the roof. So do you have to do a lot of travel to go to these different places, or is a lot of the resources now more accessible to you, going to libraries virtually?
So it's really a mix. Where I can, I like to travel because I think you're able to tell the story a lot more compellingly if you've got first-hand experience. And if I can't go, then I at least want to speak to someone who has been, or who was involved in the discovery themselves, or who has knowledge of it firsthand, because I think that's very important. And I think, both of these books cover vast areas of history, and there are people who spend their entire lives deeply researching one aspect that I end up covering in a line or two, and their expertise is so deep compared to my own. So I think you've got to be pretty humble, and you've got to realize that you're writing a general history, and you've got to check wherever you can, because no one wants to make a stupid mistake.
Right.
And so I try and check wherever I can. I try and sort of speak to the right people. I also try and send my chapters off to historians who I know work in this particular area, to say, would you mind giving this a read over? And very often people are very happy to help with their time. But yes, I do try and travel wherever I can. And I'm working on a book at the moment. I'm a little bit sad, actually. In order to get the best internet reception, I'm doing this practically sat on top of my router. But if we were down in the shed where I usually work, where the reception isn't always as reliable, I could show you. I'm working on my third book at the moment, and I've got like my files that I'm working on, so you can sort of see a little bit more of how exactly I do my research. And I've also got the book that I'm working on now is about a journey, and I've got the map of the route sort of on my wall, so that I can visualize it in a different way. And and my husband and I are, again, we're not quite in the right place. Again, I'd like to turn my laptop around so I could show you, but my husband and I are hoping to do the journey, to recreate the journey ourselves next year. And we've bought a Toyota Land Cruiser, and we're hoping to do that up and then do the journey next year ourselves, so that we can hopefully express to the reader better and more clearly exactly what these people would have seen, because we'll know a little bit about what they've seen, a little bit more about what they've seen.
So Lucy has the same question that I have, which is on the next book. But if you can't share, that's fine. She says no pressure. I'm not going to say no pressure. If you can't share, but I had the same question. I now know that it's not about some sort of air or sea voyage, because it's in a car. So I don't know if you can or want to share about it, but
yeah. So it's about this incredible car journey that took place in 1907. It crossed 2 continents, and this was at the very dawn of the era of the automobile. They'd only just really settled on petrol as the most effective fuel. We were only a few years away from races in which 48 competitors turned up, and there'd be 20 different methods of propulsion, including clockwork, steam, gravity, you name it. So this was a really new technology, and yet they crossed this vast distance, 16,000 kilometers, across the world, really, at a very interesting time. The particular era in which they were traveling, lots of the countries that they traveled through, including China and Russia, were going through very tumultuous periods in their history. And my book is going to be about this journey, but also about the wider history, the development of the car and the impact it's had, and also about the landscapes through which they were traveling at the time, and how they have been transformed over the past 100-odd years by the car, and by what the fuel that we need to fuel the car, and the roads that we need to allow us to drive in a sort of in a much more pleasurable way than they were able to drive, because at bits there just weren't road, and there were no petrol stations. So it was a challenge.
Wow, that sounds great. Okay, well, I'll put it on my list. And when do we get that? When does that hit our? Those steps?
So I'm still researching it. So not for a
Oh,
while.
you still have to do the drive. Yeah, and you have to do the drive, right?
I have to do the
Right.
drive.
Right.
But I write a newsletter about my research. So if anyone wants,
Okay.
just simply can't wait, they can go to my website, which is kassiasintclair.com, and there's a little link there for my newsletter. And I, basically drop little bits of my research and
Great.
what I'm working on at the moment into this newsletter. So you can follow it there. But I'm hoping that it'll be actually on shelves in the UK and the US in 2022. So
Great.
a little while.
Are you going to just out of curiosity, when you do the drive, are you going to try to document it? Like, are you going to try to document, like, I can imagine there's a whole bunch of millennials out there who are like, oh, it's going to be on my Instagram feed. It's going to be the whole, pictures from every place. Are you going to document it in some way? This is sort of separately from the book.
I think so, because one of the issues that I've had with the structure of the book and thinking about how I'm going to structure it is that you've got several different competitors who are moving at different speeds through the landscape. And then I've also got, oh, thanks, Lucy. And then I've also got, I also got the little bits of extra information about the landscape and about the technology that was happening at the moment. And so I've always felt that even though I'm going to be doing the journey myself, I don't want to add that into the mix, because I think that the reader will just be like, okay, what century is it? Are we with one of the drivers who's taking part in the race now? Are we with Kassia? We don't know. So I sort of want my own journey to be a completely separate thing that will inform and help the book that I'm writing, but I'm not going to put myself into the book. And so I do think that I'll probably end up documenting the journey in a way, although I hadn't really thought about whether it's going to have its own dedicated glittery Instagram feed or whatever, but it's probably going to be low key because I'm not too sure. We haven't figured that out yet, but I'm sure there will be something.
That's FAFA, right? That's where. Right? Is that the word that I just learned? Yeah. All the other details.
FAF.
FAF. Right.
FAF.
All the other details. Yeah.
All the other details. The FAF. The extra FAF.
Yeah. The extra FAF. Yep. There's a lot of it. So does anyone else have any other questions? We've got a few minutes left and no need to push to the end. So if there are no other questions, I don't see any rolling in. I will say thank you, Kassia. This was great. So much fun. I'm looking forward to the next book. It's great. Congrats. Thanks so much for coming on. Everyone, thanks for coming on today. We're not going to be here tomorrow. I had to rebook tomorrow. Friday will be later in the day, Eastern time, because of childcare issues. So we'll be here at 4:30 Eastern time with Mike Bostock, who was one of the developers of the D3 JavaScript language. So different thing. So anyway, thanks again, Kassia. Appreciate it. It's great.
You. Bye. Thank you for
Thanks, everybody.
Questions.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Nice to see you.
Bye.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Kassia. Bye, everybody.